with a couple of very quick introductions. I'm going to go over how you can submit questions to us, which I will then read back for the benefit of the folks on YouTube. Hello, I know there are at least 3 of you watching right now. And then we will jump into conversation. So my name is Stacy-Marie Ishmael. I am the managing editor for cryptocurrencies, which we will not be talking about today, at Bloomberg News. I'm getting my mic adjusted. All right, here we go. I'll say that again. I'm Stacy-Marie Ishmael. I'm the managing editor for crypto at Bloomberg. I am joined, to my great delight, by 2 people who I have learned so much from, especially as it relates to how to actually do journalism and not just tell yourself that you're doing journalism. To my immediate left, I have Errin Haines, who has the job title that I've secretly always wanted, which is editor-at-large of the 19th. The 19th is, I think, one of the more interesting recent entries into the world of journalism, digital journalism, topic and theme-focused journalism, and Errin will talk a little bit more about what the 19th is, what they do, and why they do it very shortly. Prior to being editor-at-large at the 19th, you may have seen Errin on TV, you may have heard her on radio, you may have read her in the pages of the Washington Post, or seen columns from hers popped up. She has been a really prolific and, I think, provocative media commentator and journalist for a very long time, with a particular focus on really reporting out issues in ways that they don't often get covered. Next to Errin, we have Ashley Alvarado, who has spent the better part of a decade, more than a decade, being really focused on the intersection of community engagement and journalism, 2 things that are more of a spectrum than we sometimes believe. She's currently the VP of Engagement and Strategic Initiatives at Southern California Public Radio, and much like Errin, is also a person who tends to approach problems from a place of what if we are the bad guys, rather than what if our audience isn't that smart? And I think that's really going to be a focus of the conversation here today. Sometimes when folks think about news fatigue, the way that we tend to start is, well, why aren't people listening to us? Why is everyone tired? Why isn't our news reaching the people that we want it to reach? Rather than from a place of, what are we not doing that is going to break through to the people that we say that we want to serve in the ways that are going to be useful to those folks. And that's where we're going to start the conversation today. So Ashley, I'm going to ask you a question. When we were doing our pre-prep, one of the things that you said that really stood out to me was, if you are a certain kind of person, media has never really spoken to you. And all of your interactions with journalism have always been exhausting, because you are portrayed as, a thug, a criminal, somebody who should only be covered as a victim or a villain, don't necessarily have a sense of agency, don't necessarily have a role in your own story. And for a lot of people, for the first time, they are experiencing a kind of exhaustion, and they are feeling like, wait, hang on, that's not how I would tell my story. And I'd love for you to just kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure, thank you. I was thinking about it as I was walking over today, and I had the same response when everybody started talking about tiny homes, and they started to be trendy, and they had shows dedicated to it, and people wanted to talk about tiny homes and how great they were. And I was like, well, I grew up really poor, so I always had a tiny home, and that's nothing new to me. And so when we have conversations about news fatigue or how hard people are having to work in order to process journalism sometimes, it takes me back to the feeling or the understanding that for so often, I grew up in a town that was 92% white. My sister and I were at one point the only Asians and the only Latinas in our school. And so there was no coverage for us. There were few role models for us. And so we didn't see our experiences in the journalism that we consumed. And I consumed a lot of journalism. I was that kid. But then beyond that, when there were stories, it was a translation that was happening for a different audience. And so it's the times when you're hearing something that seemingly has to be sanitized or washed for others in order to have it be palatable or understandable. And so now there is a lot that, I'm not saying that the news isn't tough. because it is. And it is hard to process so much of what's going on. I was in a really great session this morning about our biased brains and understanding how hard it is for us to process the multiple things going on. But at the same time, if you are just now experiencing news fatigue, in a lot of ways, that just seems like a luxury to me.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that, news fatigue is absolutely about folks who are feeling, unseen and unheard so much, right, in our society. And I think the pandemic has really, people are fatigued of a lot of things, right? But they're definitely fatigued in many ways. They're fatigued of the status quo, right? And they are determined not to go back, right? There will be a new normal for them on the other side of this. And I think that we are seeing audiences say that about the news that they are consuming. If they are not going to see themselves or hear themselves reflected in journalism, that they are demanding that is something that happens, or they are making choices about the kind of news that they are going to support and that they are going to consume, that they're going to share. Because if they're not seeing that, then they're already feeling overwhelmed in so many ways. They're feeling overwhelmed with the information and the news that they're getting, and so they have choices to make. And part of not being news fatigued for a lot of people, especially communities of color, marginalized folks, women, you name it, is to be able to make choices that are about journalism that is representative.
So I want to pause there, and because I heard a couple of different things. You started with the anecdote about, if you're poor, your house is small and it's not trendy and it doesn't have a show on there's no reality series about my beautiful tiny house, if you are from a lower income. And then Errin, you talked about the fact that, news fatigue comes from not only seeing news that isn't about you, but sometimes seeing news that is about you in really negative ways, or in ways that by consuming it, by reading it, makes you feel like you have less control over your life. And I am not a person who is pro or against what you will sometimes hear described as solutions journalism, right? Where the idea is, well, the way to make people more invested in the news is to give them ways to do a thing, right? Like you give them an off-ramp. You're mad about a new cement plant opening in your town in Texas. The solution is call these 3 different legislatures, express your opinions to them. Surprise, surprise, that Texas cement plant is 100% still going to open, no matter how many times you call those legislatures. And the mere fact of trying to give somebody an off-ramp is not necessarily a solution to the problem. But we do sometimes as journalists think, okay, well, if the news is going to be bad and I can't do anything about the badness, how can I make this not my problem? How can I put the burden back on the audience to solve this? Because we are uncomfortable as an entity with anything that looks like activism, right? Anything that looks like we're going to help you solve those problems, we're going to do things. And I'd love, Ashley, for you to speak to a little bit about how you have helped people understand where information turns into news and where news turns into things that are actually empowering rather than merely have the appearance of being helpful.
I think I would start just by, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, if I'm remembering time correctly, and I'm in no way convinced that I am. As journalists, and I always want to be as specific as I can in the we, but in defining the we, that is, as journalists, we spend a lot of time thinking about news and we're thinking about journalism, but when we're having conversations with community members, what they need and want is information. And so I think that the first thing is to just spend some time getting really intentional about when are we identifying a need for information and when are we identifying a need or a desire for journalism. I'm in public radio. We're never going to stop wanting the stories that sound audio rich. We're going to want to offer the opportunity to delight folks, but we also have to get really serious about meeting people's information needs. And that also includes not assuming we know them. And so spending the time having more avenues for people to share what they need, to surface what they need. There are some really great organizations represented at the festival this year. If you're thinking about the work that Outlier has done, if you're thinking about the work that City Bureau has done, And then other organizations that are built entirely out of listening, something like Oakland Side. So, one of the things that we had talked about too, just before I get back on track, was understanding like how do legacy organizations retrofit, or when do you build an entirely new foundation and what the opportunities are there. The other part, just with what you were saying, I think when we spend the time, and there are a lot of opportunities, a colleague of mine, Ariel Zorolnik, is on a train right now, but she's come into our organization, and we're doing a lot of human-centered design research now, too, to say, we're not going to assume we know what you want. We're going to spend the time investigating it, and it allows us to do different offerings. So when I think about our early childhood coverage, for example, we had spent 7 years covering everything that had to do with early childhood, and we were really thinking about how can we be something for everyone. And in the research we did, we found that people didn't want a high-tech approach. They didn't want something for everyone. They wanted everything for someone. And so we stepped back and said, we're not going to do high-tech, we're going to do high-touch. And in that, we were able to fundamentally change the relationship we had with folks. As somebody who grew up with limited access, I know that information is the thing that allows me to have the most agency. And so that's something that through our work we're really trying to do.
And Errin, as a person building something, what is your approach, and is it different or is it the same?
Well, let me just, Ashley's making such a good point about just the idea of journalism as public service, right? Like the solution is to give people news that is serving them, and that is what is helping folks feel empowered. We started the 19th, again, because we had around issues of gender, politics, and policy, but helping people to make the direct connection between their daily lives and how politics and policy was impacting that, right? But also showing the ways in which folks in these communities were not just being impacted by, but were also responding to our democracy and our society, right? How to participate in that. And so what we knew was that those audiences were absolutely engaged in the democratic process, whether they were necessarily political or not, or maybe they were wanting to get political and needed to know how to do that, right? And so we're doing explainers that help them with that. But then we started in January of 2020, so 3 months in, no more campaign trail in America because pandemic, right? And so then what do? Well, what do we know? We know that people of color, we know that women, we know that other marginalized folks were the ones that were being impacted by and directly responding to the pandemic. And really on the front lines of this thing. And yet because of the many mixed messages from the federal, state, and local level, we're not really clear on how to navigate the pandemic, right? People who were caregiving and who were caregivers who needed to know how to navigate the pandemic. And so we saw traffic really spiking for us because we were providing them with information that they needed, and for them that was news, that was useful, right? And also helping them, because we are sharing the experiences of these communities that maybe were not always being voiced in traditional mainstream legacy media, they were seeing themselves reflected in that, and so they're sharing that. They're feeling community, even in the midst of this pandemic, social distance, isolated environment, and also meeting people where they were. Our news is free to consume and free to republish, so not only are we giving access to these marginalized communities that we are covering, but we are also making sure that if they may get it from finding us on our website, finding us on social media. They may get it from our free newsletter, which publishes every single day that everybody can get at 19thnews.org, right? Or they may be getting it from one of the events that we're doing that is based around issues that they care about, whether that's climate, whether that's the pandemic, whether that's the economy, education, whatever. So, I think you're part of mitigating that fatigue. People were actually excited about news that they felt like was relevant to their lives. And that was not something that they necessarily were finding in a mainstream legacy setup, particularly around political journalism, because we know that that's been too white and too male for too long, right? And so starting over, really, for us at the 19th, we felt like that was the fastest and best way to really address some of that.
Okay, I have about 5 follow-up questions, but before I do that, I'm just going to ask can you show the slide with that folks can use to submit questions, please? So in order for you to submit questions, because we're trying to be COVID friendly, let's not be COVID friendly.
COVID
Screw
unfriendly.
COVID. We're trying to be COVID protocol
hostile.
friendly. We've set up for you a Slido. So if you go to sli.do and you enter the code 376413, you'll be able to submit questions. I'll see them pop up here on one of these several screens that I'm looking at.
You are multitasking.
I truly am. And then I will be able to ask them to the panelists, and it's also just a better experience for our folks on the live stream, and I think there are more than 3 now. So Errin, one of the follow-up questions that I have for you is around, you mentioned first that people weren't seeing themselves represented in the coverage, but then you flipped to, and one of the reasons for that as it relates to political coverage, for example, is because the core of most political reporters are, white men. How are those things related, right? Like, I think that we can sometimes do the logical leap of, in order to transform your coverage, you have to do X, Y, and Z, but I think it might be beneficial to sort of spell out what that actually looks like.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think that one of the things, mercifully, thankfully, that has come out of kind of this reckoning around inequality institutionally, and journalism being one of those institutions, is the idea that, objectivity is very easy when your default setting is being a white male, right? When we started the 19th, what we tell our reporters is that your lived experience is an asset and not a liability to your storytelling, right? And so we are looking for people who are bringing a range of perspectives. Our newsroom is distributed across the country, so we do not have journalists that are just kind of in the Beltway, in the ivory tower, kind of parachuting into communities and characterizing people in ways that may be inaccurate or stereotypical or worse, right? So, me, for example, being a Black woman covering politics, something that I've spent most of my career doing, I'm bringing that lens to the work to center people who maybe who were not traditionally centered. Of course, they discovered Black women in the 2020 election, but that's another panel for another day. But really having those perspectives it helps to expand our country's imagination about who gets to participate in our democracy and who is allowed to have power, how people get power. These things are absolutely related, because just to back up to 2016, if you will. 2016, you had one woman running for president. You had all these white men covering this one woman running for president. There were certain narratives that persisted about women voters, women running for office, you name it. Fast forward to 2020, 6 women running for president in the United States, right? All different kinds of women. And yet somehow there were the same kind of narratives about, electability, which P.S. somebody is electable if you elect them. That's what electability
Weird how
means,
that works.
right? But yet that was not the conversation, right? And that was not something that was specific to where I was working. It was really a problem across our industry and across political journalism, because we knew, the political teams had changed some, but they had changed not nearly enough, not only in terms of the storytellers, but also in terms of the gatekeepers who were deciding, making choices about what kinds of stories we were going to tell about who and where we were as a democracy, despite the fact that women are half the population and half the electorate, not a special interest group, right? Yeah.
One of the things that you said to me actually yesterday, citing one of my favorite journalism organizations, the Maynard Institute, is that diversity is an activity and not an end goal. And I'm old enough now to have been in every possible kind of conversation about diversifying newsrooms. Like I could just write you an AI script. Of if you ask me this specific question, this is how this conversation is going to go. And one of the more, shall we say, well-meaning questions is but look, we hired XYZ. That will fix all of our problems, surely, right? It'll make our coverage more representative because the byline on this story is X. But Errin, you mentioned gatekeepers and the fact that at the editing benches in a lot of places, and certainly the senior management and the CEOs, you don't find the same concentration of effort necessarily that you might do in the reporting ranks, even if you're making progress there. But Ashley, I would love for you to elaborate a little bit more on the idea of a process that gets us to the type of storytelling that Errin is describing.
Sure. So in a session I was in earlier today, I was actually like, should we publish our org chart and put everybody's names? Because one of the things, again, when you're thinking about diversity as an activity and not the end goal, to start there, it's this understanding you want to hire diversely. You want to think about how you're creating a welcoming environment, and how you're providing paths for people to succeed and to grow in the organization and to want to be in the organization, so that you can create internally the kind of culture that you want to have in supporting audiences. So often we think about, and I've definitely been in these conversations around engaged journalism, we want to do engagement, but unless you're doing engagement internally, you can't do it externally. So when you're thinking about the processes, I'd first say, look at what the opportunities are. And this is, again, another panel. I did this panel earlier in the week.
It's on YouTube, you can find it.
Yeah, you can find it on YouTube. But don't Google me necessarily otherwise, because there's also somebody who was on the People's Court and a lot of softball. Not me. But sorry, it's been a long week. But when you think about how you operationalize diversity, equity, inclusion work, how you make it part of everything you're doing, so that you can then offer the kind of journalism, the kind of information that you need for folks. So I think that's a really big part of it. And then also going public, having your audience. I think the 19th has done a tremendous job of this saying, here's what we're setting out to do. If we're not doing it, we're holding the space for you to let us know, and to have that kind of agile approach so we can change course. But I do think we have to have a lot of different avenues for that kind of listening, so that we know we're doing it, and then to have the checks and balances in place.
Thank you for saying that, Ashley, because it is, what you're getting at is a conversation about power sharing and
Yes.
the relationship between
Or redistribution.
the media and our audience, right? A lot of what our political coverage is, what we are not interested in. We're not interested in horse race journalism. We're not interested in journalism that is only concerned with the people that have the power, right? Or the idea that voters and people on the ground are people that do not have power. And so centering them, hearing from them about what their issues and priorities are, instead of having those issues and priorities dictated to them by people that are either running for office or who are holding office, is really, really important. Not only in terms of that kind of representative journalism, but also to really kind of create and earn trust with the audience and community that we're trying to create.
Yes, and then we have two questions that exactly segue from what you were saying. So
Great.
Good job, audience, on this.
So the thing I would say is, when you do that, when you look at the work that newsrooms who've adopted a citizens agenda approach have taken, when you think about stories that are done through that listening, they perform better. So I think that's a really important thing to say, that generally speaking, these are ways that you're building trust with audiences, and this is ways you're building habit. So when we're thinking about a conversation about news fatigue, actually listening, respecting, and serving the audiences you're going after is a really, really big part of that formula.
So I want to push on that a little bit, because we have two questions that are very much about metrics. One of them asks that question: is social listening a cure against news fatigue? And I think it will be helpful to define the difference between sort of listening and action a little bit. Like, you can listen a whole bunch and not really hear anything useful. And the second is, how do engagement metrics affect news fatigue? Are there other forms of impact beyond the usual ones like clicks and subscriptions that align more with that qualitative focus that you are both describing?
So I'll go first, and then I think you'll probably have really good stuff to add. You measure what matters, and what matters is measured. And one of the big issues is there hasn't been a commitment to rigorous measurement of metrics related to engagement, related to listening. There's also a lot of confusion between audience engagement and community engagement. And so when we're talking about audience engagement, that's often super serving the existing audience through digital, through other avenues. And then there's community engagement, which can be many different things, but thinking about what's the work happening offline. How are you spending time identifying information needs, habits, how you can better serve folks, and how you can move toward them instead of just asking people to come to you. So I think we have to get more rigorous in the measurement of that, but then we have to embrace the quantitative and the qualitative. So one example that really goes back to power sharing I think of this community-centered storytelling series we did, and it started with this understanding of, well, we really want people to listen to us, so guess what? We should listen to them. And then it was this trust, because if we want people to trust us, we should trust them. We should trust the legitimacy of their stories, and we should trust that audiences are going to show up and see that value. It's not up to us to tell them, hey, this matters. They can see that for themselves. And when we did that, we were filling thousand-seat rooms with folks who did not look like a traditional public radio audience and who didn't show up in any of our databases. And so that was, taking the journey. For those who don't know, the public radio journey typically is 8 years from discovery to financial support.
In the U.S.
In the United States, yes. And so in some instances, that got down to months because we were sharing power. We were being kind of faithful and demonstrating that relationship. I keep thinking when, we say, like, we want you to come to us. We want you to support us financially. We want you to do all of these things, but we're creating a hostile environment and then inviting folks in. So how do we instead have the welcoming be part of it? And that's through the listening, that's through the engagement, that's through all this stuff.
So I do think part of this is also a conversation around how we are defining impact, right? And I think a lot of that for us at the 19th is to help folks who have not traditionally felt empowered by journalism to feel that way. And that's not necessarily, that's not activist journalism. We are not an activist newsroom by any sense of the word, but like regardless of your politics, if we are helping you to be able to vote, for example, because we know that voting is under attack in the United States. That is not something that we're going to both sides. That is just a fact, right? And so people, regardless of what their politics are, we want you to have access to the ballot. We are going to talk to you about how to do that. If whatever number of people are able to do that or are able to figure out how to do that as a result of something that they saw on the 19th, that is a win for us. That is a success for us. We had a story, our economy reporter wrote a great story about diaper banks in the pandemic, right?
Can you explain what a diaper bank is?
A diaper bank. Diaper banks are where it's a resource for for parents that need access to diapers because they are having financial challenges. Obviously, the pandemic with people losing their jobs or being either unemployed, underemployed, or just having to make different choices because of the challenges of the past 2 years, need access to essentials. Right, and so
the U.S., just to be clear, does not have a social safety net. For the Europeans who are wondering about this question. So.
And so, this story about diaper banks did huge numbers on our site. Why? Because that was a thing that people not only saw as something that they were able. I can have this is a resource that I can avail myself of, but also people who wanted to support those diaper banks. That was a way that they felt empowered in terms of being able to help somebody else in that way. And so that is a measure of success for us as well. And frankly, I mean, just every time that somebody feels seen or heard in a way that they were not, people are, the beats that we have prioritized, whether that's caregiving, whether that is, parents in the pandemic, whether that is frontline workers, when those folks are feeling seen and included and like they have agency in our democracy as a result of the political journalism that we are doing, like that is impactful for us.
One of the things, there's some subtext here around power sharing, which is that people with power in media organizations prefer to be in a position where they think they are using it for good rather than in a position where they feel like they have to cede it to other people in a media organization or to our audiences. And I'll share an example. During the pandemic, I was at the Texas Tribune, which is a statewide local news organization based in Austin, and we were very aggressive in covering attempts primarily by the Texas Republicans to make it incredibly difficult for people to vote. And we would get emails, and specifically my reporters would get emails pretty much every day saying that was covering voter suppression was a left-leaning position, that it was an activist position, that it was taking a side in a extremely heated political battle. And, these weren't always emails from, random person on the internet. These were emails from funders, because it was a it is a nonprofit news organization. These were emails from capital, very serious people in, state politics. And there were editors at the Tribune who were worried that they were doing journalism that was being perceived as activism. And we had to have a lot of conversations about the difference between covering facts that are contested and taking sides. And I think that that is also a conversation that is often sparked by, or should be sparked by, the decision to do more listening to our audiences. Because sometimes what they are telling us that they need, or sometimes what we are hearing that they need, can be really uncomfortable for us to transform the way that we do things in order to serve them.
That's such a good point that you're making, Stacy. One of the beats that we prioritized early on at the 19th, and that frankly expanded the way that we approached our work and our mission, was when we decided the LGBTQ coverage was going to be a priority for us. So the 19th is named for the 19th Amendment, which is the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, guaranteed some women, not all, access to the ballot in 1920 when it was ratified. But what we came to realize fairly quickly was that the LGBTQ community was finding a home with us as a mainstream national outlet in a way that really did, I'm not going to say that it didn't exist at all, but really for LGBT, mainly they were finding their coverage in LGBTQ specific publications. And so for a mainstream national outlet to say, no, you are a part of this democracy, you are part of this society, we are going to talk about you as voters, as elected officials, as candidates, just as we would talk about anybody else, but also we understand that there are issues that are unique to you. That was something that resonated very deeply with them very early on and helped them find a home with the 19th in a way that is very affirming for us as a news organization, right? So part of that, you talk about, again, not wanting to both sides certain issues. Another thing, we do not both sides voting rights, obviously being a newsroom name for the 19th Amendment, but we also don't both sides human rights, right? And so when we see the trans community in America being under attack in these state legislatures, that is an existential issue for a significant number of voters in America, right? Like at bottom line, like that's what that is. It's not, regardless of however people feel about that, like the reality is that is what is happening. That is a big part of what is happening in our politics in the U.S. And so, choosing to cover that may be something that some people would try to challenge as, taking a side on something. And it's like, framing it as, these laws are making people less free. Some people would say that, would challenge that as, whether or not that is fact. We do not, we don't take that position. We are informing folks so that they can feel empowered, so that they can feel seen, so that their story is being told in a mainstream outlet, not just to reflect them, but for the people who are in their lives, who care about them, and for people in their communities who need to know that this is happening. Like that, there's news value in that, and covering that factually is not about, that's just not about people's feelings, and it's not up for debate.
One of the things that, and I see folks asking us this question, is around, some of what we talked about just now is like really heavy stuff, right? And the idea, an idea which I think is correct, is that sometimes when we talk about news fatigue, we talk about the fact that people are just like, I cannot deal with any more crises. I'm like, it's like literally a pandemic, there's a war. If you are a member of the LGBTQ community, or if somebody in your family is, you're looking at multiple state legislatures across the United States attempting to, legislate folks' ability to talk about their existence away, and that can just feel exhausting. And so one of the questions is, if there is so much negativity, how do we give people the ability to essentially opt out, and should we give people the ability to opt out?
I guess I'll go. I think we have to understand that we're serving whole people, And so we do want to be part of facilitating joy and thinking about that. I mean, I think when you brought up solutions journalism, one of the things for me is it's not necessarily this is the joy, but it's saying like just knowing there are people out there who are trying, knowing that you're not experiencing these things alone. And when you're covering it, you're going to cover things through that lens when they fail sometimes too, but we're going to demonstrate that there's that work happening too. And then on the other part of it, again, I just think is that when we think about like the positive stories, bringing that inclusion lens to everything you're doing too.
Yeah, that was just the point that I was going to make, and I actually talked about this in the panel that I was on just before this one. I think because of the lens that we bring to this work, because of our lived experience, right? We know that there are women, that there are people of color, that there are marginalized folks who are doers, right, in our democracy and in our society. And so focusing not just on the trauma, which so many people tend to focus on, especially when they're talking about certain folks, right? Exactly. We can really focus on the dignity, the humanity, the totality of people's lives, which has been the suggestion for journalism since, the Kerner Commission. We can pick up these suggestions whenever we're ready. But
It's
yes,
only been a couple of decades.
showing people, exactly. It's like they're still sitting right there, people. If you want to take the Kerner Commission's recommendations for how to cover communities in totality, they are available. But that's really, it's not that you don't cover some of those stories that you were referencing. It's that we have to, there has to be more of a balance, and there just has not been, and I think frankly that's why you see a lot of these new startups, people trying to drive a different type of narrative, because there has not been enough of a balance for too many of these communities.
I mean, at the other, let's say, I'm going to choose my words very carefully. At the other end of the spectrum is coverage that entirely confirms your beliefs, right? And I think sometimes when people say, oh, the news is so negative, one of the things that they're saying is, this makes me feel bad about my choices. This makes me feel bad about the decisions that I'm making in the world. I remember a story that I was sharing with different groups around. In the US, people love really, really big cars and trucks. And there is an increasing number of, reports, research, et cetera, showing that pedestrian deaths, particularly of children and toddlers, has gone up kind of exponentially and is sort of directly correlated to the increasing size of the cars on the road and how high up they are and how impossible it is to see kids. And so I shared this in what I thought was like, hey, here's an interesting link, and it was like, whoa. And several people, like, I feel like you're judging my very large truck. I was like, first of all, I didn't know you drove one, but also yes. And, and I think that that's something for us to be aware of and to reckon with, right? Which is that sometimes merely explaining how the world works puts people in a position to have to interrogate their contribution to those things, and that's not always fun. And I do think that's one of the reasons that news polarization has gotten to such an extreme, because when you are in these multiple and overlapping crises, you can sort of feel pushed into positions that are more radical than you would have to take if you weren't, right? So the framing of the conversation around returning to schools has people like at war with teachers, or masks on airplanes, and how passengers versus flight attendants have become polarized groups, or even questions about, I'll make one crypto reference, even questions about whether certain types of technology, the potentially beneficial effects outweigh the negative environmental choices. So I don't think it's always only a question of the negativity of the news itself, and sometimes it's just about, to your point, the wholeness of people and confronting them with uncomfortable things. And I do think that's part of our job, though, right? Like, for me, the distinction between news and activism and news and entertainment is a willingness to reckon with messiness and to avoid saying that this is a really clear-cut, easily solvable thing that you can handle with a petition or showing up in the right place at the right time, because like bad things might still happen, But to your point, Errin, like, here are the people who are trying to change the circumstances of those bad things.
And I think that again, that also goes back to the value of a range of perspectives, right? Which I think, because not everybody is experiencing every issue the same way, right? I think the pandemic absolutely taught us that. For people like us who maybe have had the privilege of working from home over the past 2 years, I recognize that there are many of the people in our audience did not have that privilege, right? We're navigating a completely different set of challenges in the pandemic. And so reflecting their reality for folks who don't necessarily share that reality, that's important. There's value in that. And even, from a gender perspective, reflecting different realities for people so that they understand not everybody is experiencing, whether we're talking about class, whether we're talking about gender, whether we're talking about what part of the country, what part of the world you might live in. All of these things are affecting how people are experiencing the same event, the same types of issues, the same types of institutions. And so I do think it is our obligation as journalists to be thinking about that, even if it's not my lived experience, to be thinking about the lived experiences of others as we are attempting to cover, you name the topic.
So I want to throw you both a question, which is, do you think that even though the representation of various groups in newsrooms is still at historic lows, even though newsrooms talk more about diversity than we actually engage in diversity as a process, do you think that the progress in increasing representation of different groups has contributed in any way to those challenges with audiences, where you do have perspectives from people being like, what if we thought trans kids were people in a way that, would not necessarily have shown up in those pages otherwise?
Maybe the cappuccino's not kicking in.
If I think about there's a sort of I was having a conversation with a group of folks a couple of days ago around like generational cycles in newsrooms, right? And the idea that for certain groups of editors, certain topics were too controversial or not our story. And one of the things, one of you mentioned objectivity, kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, right around the same time that George Floyd was killed, one of the biggest conversations in US journalism was around the phrase Black Lives Matter and whether journalists are allowed to say it, use it, show up at marches about it, etc. And there were absolutely major divisions, not along the lines that you might expect, but certainly there were major divisions. Particularly generational. And one of, for me, the things that was interesting was seeing the discomfort of a lot of editors who would, on the one hand, say, yes, of course, I think that XYZ is true, but I don't necessarily know if I want to write this story, or if I think that this is a story for us, or if we should be covering this. And I'm wondering if you have seen any other examples of kind of the newsroom trying to be ahead of the comfort of its audience a little bit, or having to push its audience a little bit more with some of the perspectives it's trying to bring into their reporting.
Well, in terms of the comfort conversation, I think we're still trying to push newsrooms. Like that is the beginning, right? Because so much of journalism is a function of mitigating white discomfort. Let's just be honest, right? So much of journalism is about that. And so if we are, as journalists, supposed to be leaving an honest and accurate record behind of who and where we are as a society, if one of our core values is to be afflicting the comfortable, then that is our job as journalists. That's not activism. That is not being biased. That is about doing our job. And if we as an institution, which is also part of the reckoning, as I said before, if we are not getting past our discomfort about, telling certain stories, about really telling a fuller truth, about our democracy, about our society, then how can we expect to bring audiences along in that process?
I think I would say that while inclusion and activating audiences with information might be radical, it's not advocacy. And so thinking about, we've definitely received letters saying you all have gotten, you're just doing advocacy, or I think people love to use the word woke in a complaint. Like, you're just too woke now. Like, you're, so there's going to be that, but you have to also look at what are the gains. And there is, when Errin talks about somebody feeling seen, when you talk about creating enough social capital with audiences that you have traditionally excluded in order to hold space for complexity, because in the complexity we see humanity, but we have to get to the place where we can do that so much. I spent a couple years in investigative journalism, and it was really hard for me because of that pull to black and white. There can only be black and white. We're not negotiating the gray. And I think in what we're facing right now, we have to embrace the gray and know that that's where we start to find the specific aspects of a story, again, within that complexity, where we get to see the humanity in others and to have those connections. Errin and I were at a conversation last week that was talking about polarization and trust, and one of the things was, like the trolling and the negativity, the racist things that are said, but so often those are rooted in a really specific experience. And so when you get past that and you start to have a conversation, the tone changes. But it's on us to do the work to get there.
So one of my last questions before I take one more from the chat is, I think news fatigue also affects journalists, partly because we are so close to stories that we get bored of something long before people have actually even read the story. I'm the worst person in one of those group texts, because people will share things and I'll be like, yes, I did indeed read this 3 days ago. But I try not to say that because it's disrespectful. And so I do think that we also sometimes move on from a story, or because we think it's already been done, it's already been told. One of the phrases I hear most often from reporters is like, we wrote that last week. I'm like, and now we're gonna have to write it again. How do you deal with that sort of disconnect between where a newsroom might be in terms of we've been on this, and the reality that an audience might be coming to something for the first time?
Well, I think that's right. While there's not necessarily a lot that feels very original all the time in journalism, right? Yes, that story's already been told. I do think it is incumbent upon us to keep looking at issues and saying, okay, how else can I report this? How can I look at this in a fresh way that serves my community, a community that we have not addressed this issue with before? It is on us to keep at it, because we know, yes, so much of what we cover has already been covered before, right? But we still have to cover it. We're still going to cover the economy. We're still going to cover our education system. We're still going to cover, healthcare. But how are we doing that in a way that is serving people in this moment? That is the way that we have to think about how we are approaching this work. Because look, I don't know that I thought that we'd be, writing stories about this pandemic for 2 years, but there are still so many more stories to be told about this pandemic, even as we all may want to move on from it, right? We cover presidential elections in our country every 4 years, and yet we still find a way, and we should find a way, to tell stories in a different way that are not, just kind of repeating the same kind of stereotypical narratives or reinforcing things that we really should be moving past. We owe it to our audiences, because if we're over something, what that really suggests to me as a journalist is that I haven't found a new way to talk about this thing that is important, but that is, for whatever reason, starting to feel kind of stale. But I have to figure out a way past that for myself and for my audience.
Yeah, I agree. As an editor, I think it's a reporting challenge.
One thing I just wanted to add, though, was that we do have to have conversations about mental health in newsrooms.
Yes.
And what journalists are going through right now, because part of it, how do we make this sustainable while supporting the mental health of the people who are doing the work?
Now, that is true, because if we're telling, especially now that we're telling, the buzzword is, you're bringing your lived self to work, right? So if you're going to bring your lived experience to work, you are experiencing a lot of these stories, even as you were reporting on them. There has to be empathy and leadership in journalism for that, so that people understand that it is okay for them to avail themselves, and that newsrooms are prioritizing resources for people to actually do their jobs and be whole human beings in the process.
And that's definitely another area where I think there has been a generational divide in the approach, right, where
young people are driving that conversation.
Absolutely. To kind of bring on that point, this is the last question I'm going to ask both of you. All three of us were doing a lot of stuff in journalism during the pandemic over the last year and a half. All three of us have had interesting, complicated, layered lived experiences that made doing the stuff that we were doing every day more or less challenging. How did you keep going? Like, what brought you energy to sort of let you be able to think deep thoughts about audiences while also confronting everything that you were confronting as a person?
I think it's kind of, I'm going to feel like I'm stealing an Errin response, but there's the storytelling series I mentioned before, Unheard LA. When I see people experience being celebrated for showing up as themselves, whether it's through the storytelling or through our internship program or seeing somebody move into a new position, that is, it's just like this amazing rush of energy. And again, growing up, not being heard, and I have a lot of maybe deeper experiences of not being heard, being any part of facilitating somebody being heard, I think that'll just keep me going forever.
Well, we did not envision being a pandemic baby when we started the 19th, but it has absolutely worked out for us. And, what has really been affirming, especially as we started, being out in the wild again, editor at large means I'm on the loose, right? So, but being out in the wild and having people come up to me, even here, but increasingly as I'm doing more in-person stuff, having people come up to us and say, thank you so much for what you are doing. We really believe in what you are doing. Having, frankly, our members, the thousands of people who are giving us, as little as $19 to say, hey, thank you for doing journalism that reflects my life, and what's happening in my community. That has been just very, very deeply affirming. The community that we've been able to create has been something that's been very exciting and energizing for us. But yeah, I was able to do. I mentioned this too in the last panel that I was in, a series, Portraits of the Pandemic, where we focused on one woman, one issue at a time in the poorest big city in America, Philadelphia, which is where I'm based. Being able to tell those women's stories, being able to just ask those women, how are you? How are you navigating this pandemic? To hear from them, those women inspired me because they had challenges that were so much more than what I was dealing with in my apartment with my dog, and my laptop or whatever. But hearing from them, it really did kind of keep me going, especially in the beginning, because as a political journalist, 2020 was supposed to be the Super Bowl wrapped in the Olympics, wrapped in the World Series, and that didn't happen for me, right away. It ended up being absolutely living up to my expectation that it was going to be this super consequential election even before a pandemic, but pandemic, racism, very consequential election, all happening in one. What energized me, and I think what energized a lot of my colleagues, is that we were doing work that we did feel so deeply resonated with people, and that we were able to create this community even as so many people were stuck in their homes or just not able to be together, that we somehow all found each other, and that journalism was the thing that made that possible.
That is a Great testimony to journalism. Thank you. Thank you both. We are going to end just a couple of minutes early to give the good folks in the back the ability to flip this room around. If you do continue to have questions for us, please tweet at us. We're very easy to find on the internet, not the one who plays softball, the one who's at Southern California Public Radio. Again, I'm Stacy-Marie, this is Errin, this is Ashley. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you.
Thank you all.